What if the greatest invention of our time never existed? No internet, no Google, no YouTube, no TikTok. Just imagine the world's screens, those magical windows to the world, reduced to nothing but empty glass. A dead silence instead of the constant buzz of connection. You wouldn't hear your phone pinging with a new notification, no emails flooding your inbox, no memes lighting up your feed. Just pure silence. Think about it. How would it feel to wake up tomorrow and there's nothing? No new updates, no social media posts, no messages, nothing. You'd feel like you were thrown back 100 years in an instant. Can you imagine it? A world without the internet would be a world without speed. Revolutions would fade into the distance, barely a whisper. Ideas would crawl slower than the mailman delivering letters. 1 day, 2 days, a week to reach you. And humanity, it would remain smaller, weaker, stuck in the past. Our progress would be nothing but a slow drip. The question is simple. What would life really look like if the internet had never been born? Would we still be the same? Or would we be lost? The internet was not born in Silicon Valley cafes or in dorm rooms filled with hackers. Its origins were military. The 1960s were defined by fear, tension, and uncertainty. The Cold War cast its long shadow over everything, including technology. The U.S. government feared that a nuclear strike could sever communications, leaving the country unable to react. They needed a solution. They needed a network that could survive anything. And that's how ARPANET was born. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't fast. But it was something that could last. A military-grade communication network that was designed to withstand the worst. At first, ARPANET was just scientists exchanging data, clumsy messages sent between giant computers. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't fast. But it worked. And over time, those first connections would begin to change the world in ways no one could have imagined. ARPANET was no longer just a military tool. Universities and research institutions across the country started to connect. It wasn't just about sending data anymore. It was about building something bigger. A network, a connected world. As the years passed, ARPANET began to expand. Research institutions and universities connected to the network. Ideas were flowing faster, and it wasn't just military data anymore. It was academic research, breakthroughs, and collaborations. The birth of the internet was no longer an isolated event. It was becoming a shared experience. The seeds of the future were being planted. The idea of a connected world was no longer a dream. It was becoming a reality. By the late 1980s, ARPANET began to evolve into something far greater. What was once a military experiment now had the potential to change the world. ARPANET spilled out of the research labs and into the home. The first personal computers were connected to the network. People began to experience the power of the internet in their own homes. The early days of dial-up modems, clunky PCs, and slow connections were the first glimpses of the future. It wasn't just about sending messages. It was about what this new network could do. Imagine a world without the internet. A world where communication isn't instant. Where sending a message means waiting for days, sometimes weeks. Before the digital age, writing a letter was the primary way to communicate over long distances. You'd sit down, write your thoughts by hand, seal the envelope, and trust that it would make its way to the other side. The post office was the bridge that connected the world. But that world seems distant now, doesn't it? It's hard to imagine in the age of instant emails and social media. In this world without the internet, the media held an extraordinary amount of power. The news was delivered through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television. The daily newspaper was the primary source of information, often the only way for most people to learn about world events. A single front-page headline could change public opinion, spark a revolution, or shape a nation's history. Radio and TV followed, offering the few images, sounds, and stories that could reach millions at once. The public's understanding of the world was limited by these media. Without the internet, information was slow. News traveled at the pace of the printing press, radio waves, and television broadcasts. If something important happened on the other side of the world, it could take days, even weeks, for people to find out. No instant updates, no breaking news alerts. People waited for the evening news or the morning paper to get the latest headlines. The world moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. Communication wasn't instantaneous, it was a process. Without social media, the power of global movements, protests, and revolutions was limited. People couldn't rally online, share their opinions with a click of a button, or organize events instantly. Social change took much longer to build. Revolutions were organized in the streets and by word of mouth. The spark of a movement had to travel through cities, over borders, through pamphlets, phone calls, and personal visits. It was slow, but it was real. The lack of digital platforms made activism a more localized, grassroots effort. Yet the urgency for change was no less real. Without the internet, everyday life felt slower too. People communicated with one another through written letters, landline calls, or in person. There were no emails, no text messages, no video calls. When you wanted to meet someone, you made plans in advance. There were no instant replies, only delayed communication, where waiting was a part of the process. People used paper maps to find their way and kept address books with phone numbers, a far cry from today's digital convenience. Without the internet, the entire concept of e-commerce would simply not exist. Companies like Amazon, eBay, or any online marketplace wouldn't have been born. In a world without the digital shopping revolution, businesses would have to rely solely on physical retail spaces to reach customers. Instead of browsing millions of products online, consumers would have to visit numerous stores to find what they wanted, with much less selection. Inventory management would be limited to what was physically on the shelves, and you couldn't compare prices with a click. You'd have to rely on traditional word-of-mouth or expensive advertising campaigns to make your choice. People would shop based on local availability. Large chain stores like Walmart would dominate, while small businesses would struggle to even get noticed outside their neighborhoods. If you were looking for a unique or hard-to-find product, you'd have to spend hours or even days searching multiple stores, with no guarantee you'd find what you were looking for. Retailers would focus more on foot traffic than online visibility, and marketing strategies would revolve around TV ads, print magazines, and direct mail. Without the internet, shopping would be a time-consuming event instead of a quick, seamless process. In the world before the internet, financial transactions were far slower. If you needed to pay a bill, you'd physically go to the bank or drop off a check in the mail. When you bought a product, the transaction would take days to process, with paper invoices, checks, and money orders. There would be no instant bank transfers, no quick payment apps. Everything was done manually. The days of waiting in line at the bank, writing checks, and hoping they'd clear in time were the norm. Even simple transactions required human effort and interaction. Businesses would have to rely on physical paperwork and phone calls to close deals. The pace was slower, but it was also more deliberate. Without the internet, big corporations would maintain an even tighter grip on the market. Small businesses would face an uphill battle to even exist outside of their local areas. Without the ability to easily reach customers through websites, email marketing, and social media, the cost of reaching a wider audience would be prohibitively expensive. Advertising through TV, radio, and print media would be the main method for brand awareness. But these channels are incredibly costly, limiting the ability of smaller businesses to compete. Corporate giants like General Electric, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's would continue to dominate the marketplace, as they have the resources to invest in mass media advertising. Meanwhile, smaller businesses would rely heavily on physical storefronts and local advertisements. Without the internet's ability to level the playing field, the rich and large companies would control nearly all of the marketplace, while smaller players would remain trapped in their limited geographic regions, making it almost impossible for them to expand or even survive. Small businesses had a harder time surviving before the internet. They didn't have access to the global market or the resources to compete with massive corporations. They relied on word of mouth, local advertising, and a loyal customer base. Growth was slow, and reaching new customers was a challenge. But the internet changed that. With the rise of digital platforms, even the smallest companies could reach a global audience. But before all that, business growth was a slow burn. By the time the 1990s rolled around, the internet began to change the game. The rise of e-commerce platforms like Amazon, eBay, and online marketplaces opened up a whole new world for businesses. Suddenly, even the smallest companies could reach a global audience. With the ability to sell products online, businesses no longer had to rely on foot traffic or expensive advertising to thrive. Amazon started as a bookstore, but quickly became an online marketplace that connected millions of buyers and sellers. The barrier to entry dropped significantly. What was once a high-cost venture was now something anyone with an idea could take advantage of. The speed at which business could be done increased exponentially, and the marketplace became more accessible to everyone. Small businesses that once struggled to survive in local markets now had the chance to expand globally, using digital platforms to grow their reach. Music was confined to physical formats like cassettes, CDs, and vinyl. If you wanted to hear a new track, you'd have to buy a physical copy or wait for it to come on radio. Buying albums meant visiting record stores, flipping through racks of music, and spending hours deciding what to purchase. Music wasn't instantaneous. It was an event. Listening to a new album was something you had to work for. You had to earn it, wait for it, and savor it. Movies were confined to theaters, VHS tapes, or TV broadcasts. If you wanted to see the latest blockbuster, you'd have to make plans to go to the cinema. You couldn't simply open your laptop or smartphone and watch whatever you wanted whenever you wanted. You had to wait for scheduled airings or buy a movie on VHS or DVD. The experience of watching movies was more communal, less on-demand, and far more limited. Film culture was built around anticipation. You waited for your favorite films to be released, and you went to the theater to experience them in full. Television was the go-to source for entertainment. Channels like ABC, NBC, and CBS dominated, offering a limited selection of shows and movies. If you missed your favorite show, you had to wait for a rerun or for the next season to be released months later. The concept of binge-watching was unheard of. You watched what was on when it was on. If you missed it, you missed it. TV had a schedule, and you had to stick to it. There was no skipping through ads, no pausing to go to the bathroom, and certainly no watching entire seasons in one weekend. Pop culture was far more localized. The global exchange of ideas, memes, trends, and entertainment was much slower. Movies, music, and TV shows that were popular in one country might take months, if not years, to reach another. Global brands like Netflix, YouTube, and TikTok have made culture more interconnected, allowing people from different parts of the world to share and experience content in real time. But before this, cultural exchange happened through word of mouth, physical media, or travel, limiting how quickly trends could spread across borders. Influencers, viral trends, and instant celebrity culture wouldn't exist. Artists would have to rely on traditional media outlets, radio, television, print, to get their music and projects out into the world. Promoting your art or content would be a massive challenge. Artists would need record labels, agents, and huge marketing budgets to get noticed. It would be far harder to become an overnight success. Fame would be harder to attain, and the ability for anyone to create and share content with a global audience would be impossible. Before the rise of the internet, access to knowledge was restricted. If you wanted to learn something, you had to go to a library, open a textbook, or rely on professors and experts. Information was stored in physical formats, books, journals, and papers. It wasn't instant. To research a topic, students had to sift through dusty old bookshelves, hoping to find the information they needed. Libraries were the lifeblood of education, and if a library didn't have the right book, you had to request it from another institution or wait for it to be published. Without the internet, scientific progress moved much slower. Researchers had to rely on physical mail to send their work to colleagues, and if they needed to collaborate with someone across the world, they had to rely on telephone calls or mail letters. If a scientist made a breakthrough, it could take months, sometimes even years, for that knowledge to spread across the globe. Conferences were held in person, and global collaboration was a rare occurrence. Without the internet, the exchange of ideas was much more limited, and the speed of progress was slow. Education was also far more restricted. Universities were the gatekeepers of knowledge. If you wanted to learn, you had to be accepted into an institution, pay tuition, and follow a rigid curriculum. Distance learning barely existed, and students had to be physically present in classrooms to access lectures and materials. Professors controlled the flow of information, and access to educational resources was limited to what the institution provided. The learning process was structured, but it was also slow and costly. In a world without the internet, scientific breakthroughs spread much more slowly. Research papers had to be printed and mailed out to peers. Journals had to be physically distributed. And if you wanted to cite a study, you had to hope that it was published in a journal that was accessible to your library. Many discoveries were isolated to certain regions or universities, and it wasn't easy to access the latest developments in science. Collaboration was slow, and the global scientific community was far more fragmented than it is today. As the internet grew, it transformed education. Online learning platforms, such as Coursera, Khan Academy, and edX, made education more accessible than ever before. Students could take courses from top universities around the world, from the comfort of their own homes, often for free. Knowledge was no longer restricted to university campuses. It was available to anyone, anywhere. The internet made it possible for people to learn new skills, explore subjects they never had access to, and even earn degrees from prestigious institutions, all without leaving their homes. Without the internet, governments and media organizations had almost complete control over the flow of information. News, whether it was political, social, or economic, was determined by a small group of powerful media outlets. Governments controlled the narrative, ensuring that citizens received information in a way that served their interests. People relied on state-run newspapers, television broadcasts, and radio programs for their information. If a government wanted to suppress a story or manipulate public opinion, it could easily do so by controlling the media. Political movements, especially those aiming for social change or political reform, were limited by the lack of communication channels. Without social media or digital platforms, organizing protests, rallies, or global movements was a slow and labor-intensive process. Activists would rely on physical pamphlets, word of mouth, and public meetings to spread their message. News of social movements would spread slowly, and they would have to rely on traditional methods to organize and advocate for change. In a world without the internet, transparency and accountability were scarce. Citizens had limited access to political leaders or decision-makers, and information about government actions was often tightly controlled. Political campaigns relied heavily on television ads, speeches, and printed material. There was no quick way to fact-check claims or track a politician's actions in real time. The lack of immediate access to information meant that the public often had to trust what they were told without the ability to verify it easily. Political campaigns before the internet were largely driven by television and radio advertisements, direct mail, and public speeches. Politicians had to rely on these traditional forms of communication to reach voters, and their influence was largely dependent on how much money they could spend on advertising. Social media platforms have completely changed this dynamic, allowing candidates to communicate directly with voters and mobilize supporters. But before the digital age, campaign strategies were based on face-to-face interactions, flyers, and large-scale televised events. With the arrival of the internet, political activism underwent a transformation. Social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram enabled political movements to spread quickly across borders and to millions of people. Activists could now organize protests in real time, mobilize support in minutes, and bypass traditional media channels. The Arab Spring, for example, was organized and publicized through social media, showing how the internet gave people the power to challenge their governments, spread awareness, and demand change. The digital age revolutionized how societies engaged with politics and how they held leaders accountable. In a world without the internet, communication would be slower, more personal, but also more disconnected. If you needed to talk to someone far away, you would pick up the landline or send a letter. Letters could take days, even weeks, to arrive, And if you wanted an immediate conversation, you had to rely on phone calls. But unlike today's instant messaging, these conversations weren't instant. You'd schedule a time to talk, and sometimes even wait hours before getting through to the person you were trying to reach. The pace of communication was slower, and your connection to the world felt distant. Without social media, interactions with friends and family would be limited to in-person conversations, phone calls, or letters. Socializing was a more deliberate activity. If you wanted to see your friends, you had to plan ahead. There were no status updates or instant messages. Instead, you would have to write or call, and you couldn't share pictures or thoughts in real time. The notion of keeping up with friends' lives was more about the actual moments spent together rather than scrolling through endless feeds. Before GPS and digital maps, navigating unfamiliar places meant relying on paper maps or asking for directions. If you were driving somewhere new, you have to pull over to check your map or ask a stranger for help. If you got lost, you had to figure out the old-fashioned way, by trial and error, or by stopping at a gas station for more directions. GPS might have simplified travel today, but without the internet, getting from point A to point B required patience and often a bit of adventure. Shopping would be an entirely different experience. There would be no Amazon or online stores to browse from the comfort of your home. If you needed something, you would go to the store, maybe even several stores, to find what you were looking for. You would spend time wandering aisles, comparing products, and interacting with salespeople. If the store didn't have what you wanted, you might have to visit a competitor or wait for the next shipment. The convenience of online shopping would be replaced by the effort and time spent in physical stores. Entertainment would revolve around scheduled programming. If you wanted to watch a movie or a show, you had to plan ahead and be ready when it aired. You could also rent movies from a video store, but you were limited to what was available on VHS or DVD. The concept of binge watching was unheard of. Instead, you'd watch a movie or a show once and wait for it to come on again, if you were lucky. Without streaming, your entertainment options were finite, and the experience was far less on-demand than it is today. In a world without the internet, we would lose the ability to instantly communicate across the globe. Whether to video call with family members living miles away or an urgent email sent to a colleague in another country, the instantaneous connection we take for granted today would be lost. Instead of sending a message that arrives in seconds, we'd have to rely on letters, phone calls, and telegrams, all of which are much slower. The pace of life would slow down, and communication would return to being a deliberate process. Another significant loss would be the ability to instantly access knowledge. Today, if you want to learn something, you can search the web in seconds and find articles, tutorials, or videos on almost any topic. Without the internet, that instant access would vanish. If you wanted to learn something, you would have to visit a library, attend classes, or rely on textbooks. Finding the right information would take time, and for some, that information would be out of reach. The world's knowledge would no longer be a few clicks away, but instead would require far more effort to obtain. Without the internet, the concept of social media, as we know, would disappear. No Twitter to connect with people from around the world, no Instagram to share your life with friends, no Facebook to stay updated on family and events. The global connection that social media provides would vanish, leaving people isolated in their local bubbles. Social movements, global events, and real-time updates would be harder to organize and share. The speed of information would slow, and global unity would be a distant dream. We'd also lose the convenience of digital commerce. Imagine a world where you could no longer order food online, buy products with a single click, or get same-day delivery. Everything would return to the physical, in-person experience. Shopping would be more time-consuming, and the ease of comparing prices, finding deals, or browsing millions of options would no longer be at your fingertips. Small businesses would be at a huge disadvantage, and large corporations would dominate more than ever, with customers forced to visit stores instead of buying from home. Entertainment would also be dramatically affected. Without streaming services like Netflix or YouTube, your options would be limited to scheduled TV programming, cable, or physical media like DVDs. You couldn't binge watch entire seasons of your favorite show. You'd have to wait for the next episode, and if you missed it, You'd have to wait for a rerun or buy the DVD box set. The freedom to watch anything, anywhere, at any time would be gone. The entertainment industry would be slower, less flexible, and less on-demand. Would humanity be stronger or weaker without the internet? It's difficult to imagine a world without instant communication, access to information, or the ability to connect with anyone, anywhere. The internet has revolutionized every aspect of our lives, making the world feel smaller and more connected. But in exchange, we've lost a slower, more deliberate pace to our interactions and communication. Without the internet, we would rely more on personal connections, physical media, and face-to-face meetings. We would have to wait longer for information, and our ability to connect with the world would be far more limited. The speed at which we can share ideas and movements would slow. But would we have developed different ways of interacting, different methods of communication that were deeper and more meaningful? So, would we have been stronger without it? Would the loss of convenience, constant connection, and instant gratification lead to more thoughtful, meaningful connections and a more grounded existence? Or would we have been left behind, slower to adapt, and less connected in the global sense? The question is perhaps not about what we gained, but what we've lost along the way. If you've enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into more thought-provoking topics like this, don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps us create more videos for you. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts. Would the world be better or worse without the internet? We'd love to hear your opinion. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.